I am 94 years old. I spent most of my life in banking and investing, in rooms where the air smelled like coffee and fear, where people spoke in numbers the way other people speak in prayers. I watched fortunes appear on paper and vanish in an afternoon. I watched grown men shake because a line on a screen moved the wrong way. And after almost a century on this planet, I can tell you the most expensive mistake people make is not a bad trade. It is living as if life starts later. Later, after the next promotion, later, after the market calms down, later, after the mortgage is paid, later, after you feel secure, later, after you finally have time. I built a whole career on the idea of after. I told myself I was being responsible. I told myself I was building a foundation. I told myself I was doing what smart people do. And in a narrow sense, it worked. I made money. I earned titles. I learned how to read risk and spot patterns. I learned how to keep a straight face when everyone else was panicking. I learned how to sound certain in a world that is never certain. But there is one kind of risk finance never taught me to measure. The risk of waking up and realizing you postponed the only parts of life that were actually worth living. In investing, you learn quickly that everything has an opportunity cost. Every dollar you put into one place is a dollar you cannot put somewhere else. You cannot buy everything. You must choose. Life works the same way, except the currency is not dollars. The currency is attention, time, energy, presence. And unlike money, you cannot earn more time. You cannot borrow it from a bank. You cannot refinance it. You cannot make a clever deal and get it back. You spend it once. So, listen to me, not because I am wise, but because I am old enough to have receipts. When I was 23, I got my first job at a bank. It was not glamorous. It was fluorescent lights, grey carpet, and a desk that smelled faintly of other people's cologne. But to me, it felt like the doorway to adulthood. I loved the certainty of it. I loved the way a spreadsheet made chaos look organized. I loved that my work produced a number at the end, a clean answer, a score. I came from a family where feelings were messy and money was always discussed in whispers. In my house, money was the storm cloud that never fully left. So when I discovered finance, it felt like discovering a language that could control the weather. I chased that feeling for decades. At 29, I got my first bonus that felt like real money. I bought a watch I did not need. I told myself it was a reward. I wore it to meetings like armor. I checked it constantly, as if time could be managed by staring at it hard enough. At 31, I started investing seriously, not saving, investing. I learned about compounding, how small things grow if you are patient. I told myself I would compound my money until it bought me freedom. Freedom was always the future, always the reward, always the thing I would cash in later. That mindset sounds harmless when you are young. It sounds even noble. It sounds like discipline, but discipline without direction becomes a prison. And here is the first truth you need to understand about postponing your life. Postponing does not feel like a mistake. It feels like maturity. It feels like being responsible while other people waste time. It feels like you are doing the hard thing now so you can do the easy thing later. The problem is that later is not a guaranteed asset. Later is a story you tell yourself so you can tolerate a life you are not fully living. The market taught me that anything can happen. So it still embarrasses me that I treated my own life as if it was insured. I made my first serious mistake at 36, not financially, personally. I had a friend named Daniel. We started together at the bank. We ate lunch out of vending machines and talked about what we would do when we made it. Daniel was the kind of friend who could take a bad day and cut it in half just by being there. He was loud in the best way. He laughed with his whole body. He invited me to his wedding. It was nothing extravagant. A small ceremony at a lake, a band that sounded slightly off, food served on paper plates. The kind of wedding where what matters is not the production, but the people. I told him I would be there. Then, the week of the wedding, the market turned. Not a crisis, just enough movement to make my department nervous. Meetings were added. Calls piled up. The pressure rose the way it always does, slow enough that you think you can handle it. I called Daniel and said, "I can't. I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you. Let's do dinner after the quarter ends." There are a few pauses in life that you can hear even over a telephone line. His was one of them. He said, "Sure, do what you have to do." He was not angry. That would have been easier. He was disappointed, and disappointment is heavier because it feels deserved. I missed his wedding, and nothing bad happened at work. The market did what it does. It moved. It calmed. It moved again. The crisis, I imagined, was mostly theater. But something did happen in my life. Daniel stopped calling as often. Not immediately. Slowly. The way a relationship dies when you feed it neglect instead of attention. Years later, I saw him at a funeral. He hugged me politely, said he hoped I was well, and talked to someone else. That was the price of one weekend I postponed for work. In finance, they call it a drawdown. In life, it is just loss. Now, I could tell you 10 stories like that. Small decisions that seemed reasonable in the moment and turned out to be permanent. But I want to tell you about the day my beliefs finally cracked. Because I need you to understand this. You will not change because someone tells you to. You change when reality interrupts your story. Reality interrupted mine on a Monday in October. I will not turn this into a lecture about markets, but if you have lived through enough decades, you learn that the market has a personality. It gets arrogant, then it gets scared, then it gets arrogant again. It repeats human emotions at scale. That morning, the phones started ringing before the sun was fully up. The trading floor was louder than usual, like a room full of people trying not to panic. I watched the screens turn red. Accounts were bleeding. Positions that had looked safe suddenly looked fragile. The kind of fragile you only notice when stress hits it. Somewhere in the middle of that chaos, a young analyst walked up to my desk and said, "We're getting margin calls." Margin calls are not theoretical. They are not academic. They are a hand on your collar. They mean the world is no longer interested in your confidence. It wants cash. I had seen margin calls hurt plenty of people. That day, I got one myself. Not because I was reckless, but because I had grown comfortable. I had started believing my own competence made me immune. It does not. The number on my screen dropped faster than my brain could emotionally process. I felt my throat tighten. I felt sweat on my palms. I stood up, walked to the restroom, and sat in a stall like a teenager hiding from a problem. I remember staring at my hands. They were shaking. And I remember thinking something that did not sound like finance at all. I remember thinking, this is what my whole life is. I am always one phone call away from fear. When I walked back to my desk, the liquidation had already begun. Orders firing, positions closed, losses realized. The market did not care about my intentions. I went home late that night with the hollow feeling you get when something you trusted breaks. My apartment was quiet. The lights were off. My wife, Claire, was asleep. Claire was not a dramatic person. She did not yell. She did not slam doors. She did something worse for a man like me. She grew quiet. We had been married for years. We had a life that looked stable from the outside. We had nice things, plans, a routine. And somewhere in that routine, I had begun treating her like a guaranteed resource instead of a living person. I walked into the kitchen and saw an envelope on the table. It was an invitation, not to a wedding, to a friend's 40th birthday party. A simple night out. Dinner, music, laughter. Claire had written a note on the back in her neat handwriting. Please, just this one, no phone. I stared at that note for a long time because I realized how sad it was that my wife had to negotiate for my presence like she was asking for a loan. That is when it hit me. My life was a portfolio full of assets that looked impressive and a balance sheet full of liabilities I refused to see. I had money. I had status. I had a career. And I had no margin, no room to breathe, no room for people, no room for stillness, no room for joy that wasn't scheduled, optimized, or justified. In markets, when you have no margin, a small shock becomes a disaster. That was my life. The market crash did not just cost me money. It showed me the architecture of my own decisions. I had leveraged myself emotionally, not with loans, but with commitments. Not with debt, but with pressure. Not with interest rates, but with the constant demand to prove I was useful. I had made my life brittle. That is the central lesson I want to hand you. A life built only for security is a fragile life, because security is not a destination, it is a moving target. In finance, there is always another milestone, another benchmark, another quarter, another deal, another goalpost. If you tie your life to that race, you will spend decades running and call it success. Then one day you will look up and realize you have been sprinting on a treadmill. You are exhausted and you have not gone anywhere that matters. Now, let me tell you about the man who tried to warn me before I learned it the hard way. His name was Harold. Harold was a senior partner, the kind of person who could walk into a room and change the temperature. People listened when he spoke because he always sounded like he had already seen the ending. Harold had money, real money, the kind of money people think will solve their anxiety. And Harold lived like a man being chased. He ate lunch at his desk every day. He took calls during dinners. He traveled constantly, always with a suitcase half packed. One night, after a long day, we were alone in the office. The city outside the windows looked like a circuit board. I asked him, joking, "When are you going to slow down?" He smiled without humor and said, "When I don't need this anymore." I pointed at the screens. The market? He shook his head. The feeling that I matter. That sentence should have scared me. It should have stopped me. Instead, I admired him. That is how seductive the status trap is. You mistake anxiety for ambition and call it drive. A year later, Harold died on a business trip. Not a dramatic accident, a quiet heart failure in a hotel room. Someone found him in the morning. The firm sent an email. People said kind words. The office went back to normal before the week was over. Do you know what haunted me most? Not that he died. We all die. What haunted me was how quickly his life was converted into an announcement and a calendar adjustment. His desk was cleaned out by Friday. Someone else took his clients. The market did not pause, and in that moment, I understood something brutal. Work will take as much of you as you offer, and it will not love you back. So, if you keep telling yourself you will live after work calms down, you are making a deal with something that never intends to calm down. Now, I know what you're thinking. Easy for you to say. You are 94. You got to the finish line. I still have to build. Listen carefully. I am not telling you to abandon responsibility. I am telling you to stop confusing responsibility with postponement. There is a difference between working hard and living absent. There is a difference between building a future and sacrificing the present. Most people cross that line without noticing because nobody teaches them how to measure life properly. In my world, we measured everything: return on investment, risk-adjusted return, volatility, correlation, liquidity. But we never measured the one thing that would have saved us, what we were trading our days for. So here are the 3 traps I watched destroy good people in finance and in life. Trap 1. Leverage. Leverage is powerful. It can make you rich quickly. It can also wipe you out quickly. In markets, leverage means borrowing money to increase your exposure. In life, leverage looks like borrowing from your future self. It looks like sleeping too little for years. It looks like living on caffeine and adrenaline. It looks like saying yes to one more thing when you are already full. It looks like booking your calendar so tight that you have no margin for the unexpected. A life with no margin will eventually get a margin call. It will come as illness, burnout, a relationship collapsing, or a quiet emptiness you cannot name. Trap 2. Status. In banking, status is currency. People wear it, they speak it, they chase it. And status is expensive because it never ends. You buy the nicer watch and it becomes normal. You move into the better neighborhood, and then the next neighborhood becomes the new standard. You hit the milestone, and your mind moves the goalposts before you can even feel proud. Status is a treadmill with nicer shoes. Trap 3. Noise. The modern world will offer you infinite noise to keep you from noticing your own life. When I was young, the noise was newspapers, television, office gossip. Now the noise lives in your pocket. Endless news, endless opinions, endless comparison, endless content. Noise is not rest. Noise is avoidance, because silence forces you to ask, is this really the life I want? Most people would rather scroll than answer that question. I avoided it for decades. Let me translate one more finance truth into human language. In markets, the most dangerous risk is the one you pretend does not exist. That's how people blow up. They look only at what they want to see. They ignore tail risk. They assume tomorrow will look like yesterday. They convince themselves that because nothing bad has happened yet, nothing bad will happen. Then the world reminds them that reality does not care about their confidence. People do the same thing with their lives. They assume their health will hold. They assume their relationships will wait. They assume their parents will still be there next year. They assume their friends will still answer the phone. They assume their energy will be the same at 45 as it was at 25. Those are assumptions, not assets. And assumptions are fragile. When you work in finance long enough, you meet people who have won on paper. I once advised a man named Leonard. He was in his late 60s, the kind of wealthy that makes everyday problems disappear. His portfolio was large enough to support 3 lifetimes. He had a house with art on the walls that I was afraid to stand too close to. He also had a face that looked tired in a way sleep cannot fix. During one meeting, I asked him casually what he was excited about. He stared at me like I had asked a question in the wrong language. Finally, he said, "Honestly, I'm just trying not to lose it." I thought he meant money. He meant his life. A year later, he had a stroke. Not a catastrophic one, but enough to change him. His right hand shook. He walked slower. He got tired after simple things. The kind of tired that makes you realize you are not in charge the way you thought you were. When he came back for a review, he sat down and said something I never forgot. He said, "I've spent 40 years compounding money, and my body doesn't compound. It depreciates." Then he laughed, a short, bitter laugh. He said, "I kept telling my wife we'd travel after I sold the business. Then after I hit a certain number. Then after the next deal. One day she stopped asking. She started traveling with her sister instead. That wasn't betrayal. That was adaptation." He looked at me and said, "I built a fortress and lived in it alone." That is what postponement does. It does not always explode. Sometimes it slowly trains the people around you to live without you. In finance, we call that a structural shift. The market changes and the old rules stop working. Relationships shift the same way. If you are always absent, people eventually stop offering you the moments you keep rejecting. You think you can simply show up later and pick up where you left off. You can't. There is no liquidity in lost trust. There is no market for missed years. Regret is an illiquid asset. You can't sell it. You can't trade it. You carry it. Now, I want to give you a word that saved me late in life. Enough. In banking, nobody says enough. There is always a bigger number, always someone richer, always another tier. That is how the game stays alive. It feeds on comparison, but if you never define enough, you will chase forever, and you will call that ambition. Define your enough. Enough money to sleep at night. Enough work to feel proud, not consumed. Enough status to open doors, not imprison you. Enough comfort so you stop using luxury as anesthesia. When you define enough, you can redirect the surplus to what actually pays. Which brings me to something I wish every young person understood. Your life has a balance sheet. Assets are not just money. Assets are your health, your energy, your reputation with the people you love, your ability to focus, your ability to rest, your courage, your skills, your peace. Liabilities are not just debt. Liabilities are the habit of procrastination, the addiction to noise, the fear of disappointing everyone, the need to be impressive, the resentment you refuse to address, the promises you keep breaking to yourself. If you have never written that balance sheet down, do it. You will be shocked by what you are carrying. And once you see it, you can finally do what responsible investors do. You can change. Because the biggest lie about change is that it requires a dramatic personality transplant. It doesn't. It requires small decisions, repeated until they become your identity. That's compounding, not of money, of character. And one last thing, because this is where people fool themselves. Do not confuse knowing with doing. In my industry, people could recite principles perfectly and still make stupid decisions under pressure. They knew the rules. They ignored them when emotion hit. You will do the same with your life unless you build a system that holds you steady. So add one more step to the framework. At the end of each day, ask yourself, where did I spend time that actually made me stronger? Where did I spend time that I would not buy again if I could? Who did I treat like a priority, not an option? Answer honestly. Then make one adjustment for tomorrow. One, that is how you rebalance in real time before the losses accumulate. Now, I promised you something practical, not just old man regret. So, here is the framework I wish someone had forced me to use when I was 30, 40, 50. Rebalance your life like you would rebalance a portfolio. Step 1. Mark to market. In finance, you stop lying to yourself by marking the asset to its real value today, not what you paid for it, not what you hope it will become. Do the same with your week. For 7 days, write down where your time goes, not perfectly, honestly, then label each block. Invested time. It makes you stronger and more alive. Given time, it serves people you love or a community you care about. Burned time. It numbs you and leaves you emptier. Most people discover their life is heavily allocated to burn time and call it being busy. Step 2. Cut the obvious losses. In markets, you do not keep a position just because you have held it for years. That is called sunk cost. In life, sunk costs look like friendships you keep out of guilt, habits that make you worse, meetings that exist to prove you are important, projects you hate but stay in because you are afraid to start over. Cut 1, not 10. 1. If you cannot cut, reduce. If you cannot reduce, put a boundary around it. Step 3. Add automatic contributions. The richest people I knew were not just talented, they were consistent. They automated the boring, small actions that compound. Do the same with your life. Automate a daily investment in your body. A walk, strength training, sleep. Automate a daily investment in your mind. Reading, learning, creating. Automate a daily investment in a relationship. One call, one message, one real conversation. Small contributions done daily change a life faster than dramatic overhauls you quit after 2 weeks. Step 4. Put a stop loss on attention. A stop loss is a rule that protects you from catastrophic loss when emotion takes over. You need one for your attention. Decide a boundary and treat it like a contract. No phone in the bedroom, no screens during meals, no work email after a certain hour. One evening a week that belongs to your life, not your career. If that sounds impossible, be honest. The problem is not your schedule. The problem is that you have never practiced defending your own attention. Step 5. Build margin. Margin is the difference between survival and collapse. In your calendar, margin looks like empty space. It looks like a buffer between meetings. It looks like an hour you can use when something goes wrong. If your life has no margin, everything becomes an emergency. That is not productivity. That is fragility. Step 6. Invest in what pays dividends. Dividends are what you receive because you owned something valuable long enough. In life, the best dividends come from relationships. Not 1,000 shallow connections, a few deep ones. People who tell you the truth. People you can call without rehearsing. People who want your presence, not your performance. If you do not invest there, you will be rich and lonely, which is just another form of poverty. Now, I want to tell you one more story because stories make the lesson stick. When I was 70, I retired the first time. I say the first time because people like me rarely stop. We just change costumes. I told myself I had earned rest. I told myself I would finally enjoy life. On the first Monday of retirement, I woke up at 5:30 a.m. out of habit. I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and realized I did not know what to do with my own day. That is a terrifying thing to discover. Not because I had no options, but because I had trained my identity to depend on being needed. Without meetings, without calls, without the noise of being useful, I felt like air. I walked around my own house like a guest. I tried golf. I hated it. I tried reading the newspaper slowly. It made me anxious. I tried sitting still. My mind kept reaching for work like a missing limb. So I went back, not full-time, consulting. It sounded reasonable. It sounded harmless. It was the same trap, wearing a nicer name. It took me another 10 years to understand the truth. If you do not build a life while you are working, you cannot suddenly have one when you stop. You cannot retire into presence. Presence is a skill. It must be practiced while the world is still pulling on you. So here is what I want you to do, especially if you are in your 20s, 30s, or 40s and you think you have all the time in the world. Stop making your life a reward you will cash in later. Do not wait for a perfect season. There is no perfect season. There is only the season you are in. If you keep saying after about the same thing, you are not being patient. You are avoiding, and avoidance is always a negative return. So choose one thing you have been postponing and bring it into the present, not as a fantasy, as an action. If you keep postponing your health, make one appointment. If you keep postponing a friendship, send one message. If you keep postponing joy, plan one ordinary evening. that actually belongs to you. If you keep postponing the work that matters, do 20 minutes today. 20 minutes is not impressive. It is effective because 20 minutes repeated becomes a life. If you want a challenge that is simple enough to follow and strong enough to change you, do this for 30 days. Protect 1 hour a day like it is your most valuable asset. 1 hour with no phone, 1 hour with no performing, 1 hour invested in your body, your mind, or your relationships. Treat that hour like a deposit into the only portfolio that matters, the one that becomes your life. At the end of 30 days, you will not be a new person, but you will be a person who has proof you can choose. And that is how change starts. Not with inspiration, with evidence. I am 94. I have lived long enough to watch people win and still lose. I have watched people make millions and die with a heart full of regret. And I have watched ordinary people live small, honest lives and die peacefully because they did not postpone what mattered. So do not wait for your margin call. Do not wait for the crash to reveal what is fragile. Choose your allocation now because your life is already being spent. The only question is what you are buying with it.